Just a heads up before we get into today's video. Go and support the author and check out his YouTube channel, Black Volumes. It'll be linked below in the description. My name is Peter Tully, and my story is not a happy one. I protect a land that is brimming with horrors beyond your dizziest nightmares. The truth of this region is a secret safeguarded by a few burdened souls. It is our duty to shield the world from the twisted terrors within this place. I have seen things that eyes cannot discern, and I have learned things that minds cannot fathom. After 20 years of this unending nightmare, I'm ready to share my story. It is by no means a short tale, and this is only the very beginning. When I moved to Scotland in the spring of 2004, I was a young man. I left the Metropolitan Police Force behind and I accepted a position as a park ranger in the Scottish Highlands. Maria and I were hoping to start a family. It was a clean slate. "Are you sure this is what you want?" Maria had asked. "Of course," I said. "Are you?" "Well, it's a bit late for both of us to be asking these questions now." Maria laughed, motioning at the window. "We're already in Scotland." I smiled. "I know, but you can always say the word and we could hop in that car and drive back to London." "I don't care about London," she said, wrapping her arms around my neck. "I care about you." I kissed her forehead. "This won't be like the city, Maria. It's peaceful out here." "Every job comes with challenges, Peter," she said. "Are you ready to jump straight into work? You can take more time to recover." "I love you," I said, tightly squeezing my wife. "But I'm ready for this." We were so naive. The Highlands is a region of Scotland known around the world, and yet it is not truly known by anyone. At least not this particular piece of haunted woodland, a location that I will not disclose. The Highlands is a vast, sprawling region, and I pray that nobody finds my park. You would be wise to never try. When I arrived at the village's local pub on my induction day, I was met with steely glares from the establishment's handful of early morning drinkers. It was the sort of standoffish demeanor that newcomers often receive from locals, especially an Englishman in a Scottish village. Ancient prejudices never really die now, do they? "Over here, Peter," a man hoarsely bellowed. I turned to see Matthew Wright, the old man I recognized from my job interview. It had only been a month since our online call, and yet the fellow had somehow aged about 10 years or so. He must have been in his late 60s at the time, and I could only assume it to be the stress-induced aging. The result most likely of Matthew fulfilling park duties, given the previous ranger's disappearance 3 months prior. That was the real reason for Maria's concern regarding the job, the murky circumstances surrounding the opening of the position in the first place. "Hello, Matthew," I said, sitting opposite the weathered man. "How are you?" I'm well," he replied in a soft, gruff voice. "Are you and the wife settled?" I nodded. "Yes, this village is idyllic," Matthew coarsely interrupted. "Quaint, tranquil, beautiful." I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, unsure as to how I should respond to the sudden curt remark. "There is truth to that," the old man said. "But this haven is the tip of safety atop the iceberg. Beneath the surface, things look quite different." "I'm not sure that I understand," I awkwardly replied. "I wouldn't expect you to understand," Matthew said, pausing for a moment. "You impressed me with your interview, Peter. There is a reason that I asked so many questions about your time on the force. I wasn't looking for an ordinary person. I was looking for somebody who had already stared horror in the eyes." I stifled the gulp that involuntarily rose to the top of my throat. "Are you okay?" Matthew asked, possibly noticing that the color had drained from my face. I nodded, composing myself. Yes, I'm fine, I'm thinking about the woman who held the position before me. Shirley Pond, Matthew said. I understand your hesitation, Peter. Who would want to fill the position of a missing person? Well, I won't lie to you. These woods are dangerous and the job comes with risks. I know, I said. You warned me. I hadn't divulged that piece of information to Maria, as I knew that she was already uneasy about me returning to work after the nervous breakdown in London. I did, Matthew said, sighing. But, well, what do you imagine might have happened to Shirley? What's the worst thing you've imagined? I frowned at the horrid nature of the question. I imagined that she had either tumbled over a mountainous cliff edge or met her demise at the hands of an animal. Still, there are very few wild animals in the Highlands. A boar could have attacked the park ranger, but it was highly unlikely. Here's the thing, Peter, Matthew said, seeing that I had no answer. Your darkest fantasy doesn't compare to the true nature of the forest. And though I want so desperately to tell you what you'll find in the woods, I will not bother. Why? I asked, frowning. Matthew sighed. You wouldn't believe me, boy. You simply would not believe me. Try, I said. No, he replied, shaking his head. You would laugh in my face and leave. He said a lot without saying much. As I started to piece things together in my brain, the man no doubt believed in cryptids, monsters, the boogeyman, perhaps old Nessie herself hiding in the loch. Being an English city boy with a rational approach to life, I didn't believe in such things. What's out there, some sort of creature? I asked. Matthew eyed me for a few seconds perhaps, searching for the faintest hint of a smile on my face. Any sign of mockery, and I was certain that I would be fired before I even started. There are those who know what lie in those woods, Matthew said, nodding his head at a couple of the drinkers in the pub. They've seen things. Seeing is the only way to make a person truly believe. Well, why didn't you hire a local then? I asked. Look at us, Peter, we're old, too old. And I couldn't bring myself to ask our children, but a stranger, well, that seemed. Matthew suddenly paused, contemplatively scratching his face. You know, I think I've rushed into this, perhaps you. You said it yourself, I interrupted, feeling the job opportunity slipping from my grip. Nobody else is in a fit state for the position. It has to be me. Matthew suddenly slammed his fist onto the table and the entire pub fell silent. Nobody moved a muscle, nobody made a sound. I waited for the man to find his calm, collected disposition again. Peter, you don't even know what's in those woods. No, I agreed, but I know that I just have to do this, Matthew. And as you said, I won't believe it until I see it for myself. And even then you won't believe, Matthew whispered. I smiled victoriously. So, does that mean that I have the job? Only if you accept one thing, he said. Go on, I replied. Matthew sighed. Once you take this path, you cannot leave it. I nodded in acceptance. I'm not sure whether the man viewed me as courageous or moronic. A mixture of the two, I imagine. Whatever the case, Matthew stopped resisting. He begrudgingly drove me from the village to the watchtower, a wooden structure that loomed over the mountainous region which would become my domain. The Highlands of the Dead, Matthew said as we clambered out of the car. Well, that's an ominous name, I responded. Matthew sighed. Dreadful things have happened here. We've had our fair share of tragedies over the decades. The school teacher, I said, vaguely remembering a certain news story. Yes, What he did was unthinkable. I nodded, strolling towards the staircase at the foot of the watchtower. You've stopped prying me for information about the woods, the man noted. I shrugged. I know you won't tell me, so what's the use? I just know that you would run, he said. Not from fear. Most likely you would view this job as a farce. You would think me to be some sort of crackpot. I already think that, I thought, stifling a laugh. Matthew gave a rundown of the duties that I would be expected to perform. He was searching for things to say, drawing out the initiation period, possibly hoping that it would change my mind. Eventually, the man sighed heavily. All right, well, I suppose I'd better go, Matthew said. I nodded. It's going to be fine. Okay, he replied uncertainly. There were no parting words of wisdom from the old man, a man who perhaps was not really that old, more hardened by the things that he had experienced, as I would soon learn. During the first few hours of my shift, I admired gorgeous vistas from my sheltered room atop the watchtower. Stunning jagged terrain stretched to the horizon. Lakes glistened in the late afternoon sun. Luscious green pastures and rocky hillsides lay beyond my serene pine tree forest. It was a place of outstanding beauty. Highlands of the Dead felt like a cruel name to me. It was around 8 in the evening that the sun began to set, and in the soft orange glow of the day's diminishing light, I saw something peculiar. About a mile in the distance, the forest appeared to be moving. After hurriedly lifting my binoculars to my eyes, I saw that the trees had been felled, and a building had inexplicably appeared in the clearing. What the? I started, immediately grabbing my things and sprinting out the door. By the time that I had reached the bottom of the watchtower staircase, the light of the day was almost entirely gone. I turned on my torch and began to navigate through the towering trees, which had seemed so minute and manageable from the height of the watchtower. On the ground, however, I felt small and fragile. This only worsened as night came and a heavy blanket of darkness engulfed me. Oh, come on, I told myself, stop it. You're becoming a local already, believing in ghosts and demons. I blamed the tragedy of the school teacher for the superstitious nature of the townsfolk. Trauma can do awful things to a person's psyche, and the man in question had done things beyond awful to the village. I had read about it in the paper several years prior. Arnold Haversham took 3 children into the woods, committed unspeakable acts, and then hanged himself from a tree. Nothing supernatural there. Untoward, but unfortunately very human in nature. That was what I repeated to myself as I walked further into the woods, farther from the warmth and comfort of the watchtower. But when I had reached the clearing, I could no longer rationalize anything. A building had emerged from the underworld. It had torn through grass and dirt, splintering the surrounding trees. No felling or a man-made construction. This building, sprouting from nothingness, had created itself. And when I realized that I recognized the structure, I stumbled backwards in horror. It was the village school. A moss-covered, ghoulish representation of the building was lurking in the depths of the Scottish Highlands at the dead of night. How? I whispered, shaking. Matthew had been right. The horrors of the woods had to be seen to be believed. But I hadn't even seen the true horrors yet. A scream pierced the night and I tumbled to the ground, managing to hold onto my torch. The haunting, pained sound came from the belly of the demonic building, a building that had clearly just risen from Hades itself. And yet, defying all sensibility, I found myself clambering to my feet and walking towards the ajar front doors. Redemption. It had been served up on a platter. A chance to right my wrongs, a chance to forget London. I tore the splintered doors open, almost pulling one of them from its hinges. and then stepping over the bumpy ground that had risen through the cracks of the tiled floor, I shone my torch into the great abyss before me. I was lighting an overgrown, long-forgotten corridor. The apocalyptic hallway was lined with rusty lockers coated in vines. The tiles crumbled beneath my feet, giving way to dirt and rock. And as I disappeared deeper into the paranormal building, I began to regret my decision. But just like Matthew and the other villagers, trauma was guiding me blindly forwards. "Help!" A distorted voice screeched from the distance. I followed the sound down a corridor to the right, finding that my torch seemed to be struggling to permeate the thick shadows of the halls. The school's atmosphere was slanted, disjointed. There was blackness beyond comprehension within those walls, and there was a silence which gave way to the sound of my heartbeat. "Please," a girl cried. It came from a room at the end of the corridor, classroom 11A. Steadying my torch in my trembling hand, I took tentative steps towards the doorway, finally hearing something, a scratching sound in an otherwise silent building. Free hand pressed against the door, I gently pushed it open. It revealed a tiny box room with 3 chairs and a whiteboard on the far wall, but there was nobody inside. There was only the ever-loudening sound of scratching from above. "Hello?" I called. The scratching stopped, and all that remained yet again was the sound of my heartbeat, an ever-quickening rhythm. Without warning, the ceiling tiles gave way. I yelled in terror as 3 bodies came tumbling down. I fell through the open doorway and I looked up at the terrifying scene from the ground. 3 school children, 2 boys and a girl, swayed from nooses which led into the blackened void beyond the vanished ceiling. But these were no corpses. The children had hollow eye sockets burrowing deeply into their faces. Their gaping mouths revealed black chasms to match their eyes, and their skin was shallow. It scarcely clung to their skeletons, much as their tattered uniforms barely clung to their bodies. But most horribly, their necks were elongated to a couple of feet in length. With every swing, their terribly long bodies lightly brushed the tiles of the floor. "Help!" My eyes shot to the dead girl whose empty, lifeless mouth twitched to utter that ghastly plea. Body froze and I hoisted myself up and turned on my heel. I could hear moans of agony from behind me as I sprinted along lightless corridors, struggling to navigate my way out of the school. Everything looked different. I was caught in an ever-changing maze. And when I finally found the school's main entryway, the ground began to quake. The ceiling above slowly descended, and as dirt filled the school entrance, I realized that the spectral building was sinking. I sprinted towards the exit, desperately trying to maintain my footing on the rocky surface beneath my feet. I could feel the fresh air spilling through the doorway. My brain was waking from a trance. Why did I even come in here, I wondered. The haunted place had clearly wormed its way into my brain, but I was almost free of it. And then as I crawled through the half-sunken doorway, something clutched my ankle. "You belong," a sinister voice shrieked. I turned to face a hand rising from a crevice in the dirt. A near fleshless, ghoulish limb slithered upwards, and when its face emerged, the blood drained from my own. Like those of the children, it was rotten, bearing shallow eye sockets and a blackened mouth. A mouth that opened wide, unleashing a deep and unyielding cry. And as I looked upon the unliving thing, my mind filled with blanks. I remembered the picture from the news article. Arnold Haversham. The building was plummeting into the ground below, and the abomination from this dimension was trying to take me into its hollow. I dug my fingernails into the dirt, desperately scrambling to stay in the world above. And then I saw something. Illuminating the blackened hole, I could faintly distinguish another pair of rotting hands, slender but just as hauntingly unearthly. The brittle fingers coiled around the schoolteacher's inhuman face, and the man growled ferociously as an unseen creature separated from him. As my ankle finally slipped out of Haversham's grasp, I jumped to my feet, watching the ground seal above the haunted school and its inhabitants. The forest suddenly seemed so peaceful, but it had lost all of its beauty. It only had taken one night for me to understand the disgruntled man. Not stopping to catch my breath, I ran back to the watchtower, and then I sat in my office, shivering until Matthew arrived at around 5 in the morning. He saw my pale face and smiled pitifully. "I tried to warn you." How is it real?" I whispered. "What did you see?" he asked quietly. "The school teacher." Matthew Wright raised an inquisitive eyebrow and widened his eyes. "Haversham?" "Yes. Isn't that what you saw?" He shook his head. "Peter, there are many things in this forest and none of them—" "I quit," I interrupted, but she knew that already. "Wait," Matthew said sternly. "What did I tell you?" "I don't care," I said, heading to the door. The old man tightly grabbed my arm as I passed him in the doorway. "You will," he said. "Once you take this path, you cannot leave it." "Well, just watch me," I replied. "If you try to leave the Highlands," Matthew continued, refusing to release my arm, "you join the undead." "What are you talking about?" "You belong to the woods now. We all do." I stared into the old man's eyes and saw for a second the same hollow cavities that had eyed me from Arnold Haversham's face. And then I remembered the haunting entity's words. "You belong." "You're lying," I said. "Then why haven't we left?" Matthew asked. "Knowing what we know, do you think we would choose to stay here?" "You're crazy," I replied, wrenching my arm free. "That's why." Matthew followed me down the staircase as I hurried away from him. "Think of Maria," he said. "What does this have to do with her?" I barked, stopping and turning to face the man. "Everyone in this village is entwined with the Highlands," he explained, placing a hand on my shoulder. "I tried to warn you, Peter." "No, you didn't," I said, snarling as I squared up to the old man. "You lured me to this cursed village and you tricked me into agreeing to do this job. Your warnings were meaningless. You know that I would view you as nothing more than a crazy old man telling stories. You knew exactly what you were doing." "Aye," Matthew replied. "Maybe, but I had to do it for the village. We need a ranger and I'm falling apart at the seams." "Do it for the village," I cried, laughing maniacally. "What use am I against horrors of that magnitude?" Matthew gripped both of my shoulders tightly and spoke coldly. "The woods need souls. That is our purpose. We sacrifice our souls to it every night. We give it a piece of ourselves, and in return it spares the village, it spares everyone." I paused. The man's weary and worn face finally made sense. "Everyone except us," I whispered. Matthew nodded. "Everyone except us." "So I kill myself slowly like you?" I asked. "That's my lot in life." "You save the village. That's your lot in life," he said. I wish that I could offer a happy ending, but 20 years later, at the age of 42, I found myself becoming the now deceased Matthew Wright. I have assumed his role as a withered and worn-out man. A man who on a nightly basis sacrifices himself to the Highlands of the dead. And why? Well, to protect Maria, and to protect our son Henry, and to protect everyone. I strive to free myself of this prison, though there are things that I have learned over the past 2 decades. The full truth of these woods is still a mystery to me. Still, there is more to my story. This is only the beginning. In 2006, after 2 years on the job, Henry was born. "I can't believe we have a Scottish baby," my wife joked. "I'm not sure that's how it works, Maria," I replied, smiling. "We're still English." "You're living in denial," she said. "The wee lad will be down at the pub with you and Matthew before long, downing pints and talking about that one time he saw an adder snake in the forest. I don't know. I've had no idea what you two discuss." I grunted, changing the subject, but my wife wouldn't let it lie. "Why do you hate talking about life as a park ranger?" she asked. "It's just, Matthew, he's my boss and it's hard to see him as a friend," I said. I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. How would I have approached the topic? Matthew lured us here under false pretenses. The forest is cursed, we're cursed, and now our baby is too. She wouldn't have believed me anyway. Oh great, I'm sounding just like the old man now, I thought. I tried to focus on the tiny beacon of light that we had brought home with us. Life had given us something pure. I had a wife and a son. Not everything about my existence was terrible. Still, you wouldn't be here if I had a pleasant story for you. It was late November in 2006. Henry was 10 months old, and I was consumed by the duties of parenthood that I hardly had the mental fortitude to endure the forest's nightly torture. I spent most nights sleeping in the sheltered room at the top of the watchtower. My heart felt lighter in truth. The woods can't hurt me anymore, I told myself. But the pathways in my sleep-deprived brain clearly weren't connecting. I should have realized that I wasn't allowing the forest to feed on my soul, and that meant it was hungry. "Peter!" Maria screamed. Her shattering cry of agony woke me from my pre-work nap. Drenched in sweat, I rubbed my eyes and glanced at the alarm clock. 9:30 p.m., an hour before my shift began. "Maria?" I sleepily groaned. "Henry's gone," she shrieked in a voice barely human. Every tendon in my body tensed. I leapt up, donned my ranger gear, and rushed into the baby's room. The window had been shattered, and Henry's empty cot rocked eerily in the wind. I heard the smash and Peter. He was already gone when I came upstairs." Maria sobbed before screaming again. "Who would take him? Who would do this?" "I don't know, Maria," I said, embracing my wife. "But we'll bring him home. I will find him." I ran out of the house, beelining for my car. I noticed black clouds blending with the night sky. A storm approached. My neighbor Tommy was standing in his front garden. With elbows pointing outwards, he clasped his hips with his hands. He was sucking his teeth and disapprovingly shaking his head. "Careful on your shift tonight, Peter," he warned me. "Weather's taken a..." "Tommy, I need you and Maggie to watch Maria for me," I said, unlocking my car. The man frowned. "What the devil is the matter with you, lad?" I pointed at the non-existent second-floor window, and when Tommy looked up at it, his eyes widened. "What's happened there?" he asked. "I don't know," I said, opening the car door. "But I don't care about that, Tommy. Henry's gone." I didn't stop to say anything else. Something in my gut told me that I had to drive. Henry was in the forest and I could feel it. I sped through the deserted streets of our village, heading onto the curved road which led into the Highlands of the dead. And as I drove, I became aware of a growing rumbling from the sky above, a guttural groan, and then a blinding bolt of lightning illuminated the forest ahead. It was followed by a menacing thunderclap and a torrential downpour of rain. When I eventually reached the watchtower, the storm had reached a feverish crescendo of light and sound. The wooden structure was swaying uncertainly under the strain of the wind's endless onslaught. And as another lightning bolt struck the forest, it illuminated the sheltered room at the top of the watchtower. That was then I noticed something truly dreadful. The silhouette of a tall creature with spindly arms and legs. It almost had the shape of a woman, and in its arms it cradled a bundle. Henry. The lightning disappeared and the room plunged back into darkness. I flew out of my car and trudged through the thick slushy muck leading up to the watchtower staircase. Lighting the way with my torch, I took the steps two at a time, repeatedly losing my footing on the drenched metalwork. A sudden smashing noise startled me and I braced myself against the handrail. I'm surprised that I heard it over the roar of rain and thunder, but paternal instincts are unimaginably powerful, and the hair on my skin was standing upright. I leaned over the side of the railing looking up to the top of the watchtower, and then I screamed in horror as I saw two shriveled, discolored arms shakily stretching over the edge of the top floor's railing. Fingers of an abnormal length were curled around a familiar star-covered blanket. There was absolutely no doubt in my mind. Henry was inside. "No!" I screamed. I was still 20 feet from the top of the tower. I wasn't going to make it in time. The fingers released and the bundle plummeted. I felt the world slow around me. As I curled my back over the edge of the railing, I watched the blanket unravel above me, and little Henry, with limbs flailing, tumbled out of it. His terrified eyes were swimming with tears, and he screeched manically as he fell towards me. His body clunkily connecting with my chest, and I frantically scrambled to scoop him up. Against all odds, I caught him. I lost my footing for a second, but I managed to brace my body against the railing, and then I pulled the two of us to safety. Heart racing, I fled down the staircase, and I was perplexed to find another park ranger vehicle parked alongside mine. It was Matthew. "What are you doing here?" I screamed over the rain. "Maria called me. Is Henry okay?" "Leave us alone," I growled, barging past the man. "You've been sleeping up there on your shifts," Matthew continued, "not venturing out into the forest and not feeding it. Have you been watching me?" "I have a village to protect, Peter," the man said. "Well, then you take over," I yelled. "I have a baby, I don't sleep, and you didn't say I couldn't spend my shift in the watchtower." "You haven't been given the forest what it needs, Peter, so it found another way to get what it wanted." "You need to take Henry home," I said, ignoring the man's chastising comments. I took Henry's car seat from my vehicle and belted him into Matthew's car, and then I turned to face the top of the watchtower. I hadn't seen the looming, slender creature emerge. Is it still up there? I wondered, bracing for the sight of a dark shape on the staircase, but nothing came. "I'm an old man. I don't have much fuel left in the tank, boy. You don't want me to take the reins. I would doom us all to oblivion." "What did I see up there?" I asked, ignoring him. A tall woman snatched him and... "A woman?" Matthew asked, eyes wide and lip trembling. "Yes," I said. "Well, something that looked like one." Matthew eyed the watchtower. Before running around to the driver's door of his car, he took one last look at me and uttered a parting warning. "Stay in the woods tonight," he cried hoarsely. "Do not retreat to the watchtower." I watched the man speedily drive away, and I sighed heavily. I cared only that Henry was being taken to safety. But as I stood in the heavy downpour drenched to the bone, I wondered whether I might perish from hypothermia rather than whatever nightmare lurked in the woods. I had given the forest what it wanted. Not fear, it demanded attention. My baby's life had almost been snatched from me. What more could the Highlands want? Surely I had to pay for my crime of neglecting the wretched place over the months. I wished Matthew had told me what would come next. The storm ceased. Not slowly, not naturally. All sound abruptly halted, as did the rain and lightning. The clouds rapidly vanished, giving way to a patch of moonlight on the small clearing in which I found myself. A rumble began beneath my feet, the sound of earth shifting, and then a hand sprouted from the soil before me, the same hand that I had seen earlier in the evening. Spidery fingers shot outwards at a terrifying speed. Before I had a moment to react, the ghoulish palm had planted itself on my face. I sank into blackness. I wasn't in the forest anymore. I was in the world of that woman, that thing. And she showed me terrors that even after all these years, I still struggle to put into words. I won't tell you all the things I saw. Some things cannot and should not be seen. She showed me the bodies of my loved ones, such visceral images, almost tangible, and I still remember Maria's face. Tears of blood trickled from her gouged eyes, staining her cheeks. The woman tortured me with these visions for hours. When I woke, I was tucked under a blanket in my car. I panicked for a second, believing that I had shirked my duty, but then I saw Matthew's car beside mine. He was sitting on the bonnet. I emerged from my vehicle on unsteady legs and checked my watch. It was sometime after 7 in the morning. The dawning sun cast a fantastic glow over a forest, which suddenly seemed so calm and soothing. A different realm than the one of the night before. "I found you in the grass," Matthew said. "Thought you'd be more comfortable in the car." I nodded, not willing to thank the man who had sentenced me to this life. "It doesn't have to be this way," I said. "There has to be something that could end all of this." Matthew paused for a long time before saying something utterly unexpected. "You're not the only ranger burdened with this task. This undead affliction is a disease, and it's spreading. There are other villages and hamlets cursed by her." "What is she?" I asked. "Nobody knows." "Somebody does," I said. "I can't let Henry suffer this fate. I have to find a way to save him. No, I have to find a way to save all of us." "Well, I won't be around to see that boy," the old man said. "I'm so tired." And after so many years, I'm starting to understand what Matthew meant. It was the 2018 Winter Gathering, a pre-Christmas celebration for the entire village. 150 people packed like sardines in a cozy hall. A night of music, performances, and talks from prominent figures in the village. An amalgamation of festivities. "Do you mind doing the thing, honey?" I asked Maria. My wife raised her eyebrows suggestively. "In the middle of the town hall." I snorted. "Not that thing, the back thing." "Oh, right," Maria laughed. "You're such an old man." "I'll be standing up there for ages," I said, shifting uncomfortably in my seat. "I don't want to get that annoying knot in the bottom of my spine." "You'll be up there 5 minutes tops," she laughed. 36 is painful, huh?" "You should know," I replied, grinning. I received a thump on my arm, understandably. Make risky jokes and receive fitting results. But Maria chuckled and twisted my torso to the side, before lovingly massaging my shoulders. I locked eyes with the neighbors, Tommy and Maggie, who were sitting a couple of rows behind us. Mags rolled her eyes at me and Tommy rubbed his chin thoughtfully, before whispering something to his wife. She shook her head. "Oh look," Tommy said, pointing as the mayor walked towards the stage. "It's Mrs. Aver." "Oh, stop it," Maggie tutted, slapping her husband's wrist. "And now Peter Tully will say a few words," Mayor Eileen Balfour announced. "Put your hands together for our trusty park ranger." I'm not a public speaker, but given the year's events, the villagers were expecting some promising words about the future. Matthew Righted, 1 month prior, passed away, and as much as I loathed the man for tying me to that wretched place, I understood why he had done it. He tried to make amends. He had protected my family over the years. He had even searched for answers that might save the village. After claiming to have given up on the world, he craved redemption in my eyes. Matthew Wright was a desperate man, and I may well have done the same in his shoes. Maria, Henry, and I were the only people beside his hospital bed. A couple of villagers stopped by, of course, but his family had died long ago. He was the last in a long line of Wrights cursed by the Highlands of the dead. "Who's gonna keep Dad in line, Uncle Matt?" Henry asked. The old man chortled before spiraling into a coughing fit. "That's karma," I told him, smiling. He smiled back. "It's a shame that we should finally see eye to eye on my deathbed," he croaked, chuckling. "And there are, of course, a few things we should discuss before I pass." Maria awkwardly cleared her throat. "Come on, Henry." Matthew beamed at my wife and son as they walked out the door. "A beautiful family," he said. I nodded. "I'm lucky." "No," Matthew replied. "You were unlucky to meet me. Look at you, you're not a boy anymore. I stole your life from you. I should have. I shook my head. You warned me that there were things you couldn't tell me, dangers in the forest. I heard you and I felt a knot of fear in my gut. I could have listened to that instinct, but I didn't. I was carrying my own trauma. I had something to prove. But you should know that I chose to start a life here and have a family. I'm luckier than most. The old man spluttered. You know, I had a wife once. You never told me that, I said. Matthew shrugged. Long before you arrived in this village, I had already lived a full life. Paisley and I were trying for a baby. What happened? They came at night. Inhuman things from the old factory over the ridge. Nobody really knows what happened there, but we know those things used to be people. And they took her. They took Paisley. The old man cried, and I comfortably placed a hand on his shoulder. I was a park ranger. I knew about the horrors of the Highlands, of course. It was a secret passed down from the rangers to their kids. Each of us took up the mantle from our parents before us. There were more of us back then. It seems the village gets smaller and smaller with every passing year. And now you're the only ranger left. What comes after you, I don't know. But we mustn't let Henry take your place, Peter. We can't. I won't let him step foot in those woods, but I'm starting to lose hope, Matthew. For years, we've tried to uncover the root of this evil. Your family has been here for generations, and even they don't know what to do. It didn't always used to be so terrible in our village. There were good times before, before the heartbreak, the tragedy. As for the land beyond the forest, the Highlands of the Dead spread farther than our own patch, he said. I've told you this before. There will be somebody out there who knows the truth. How the tables have turned, I replied. I remember when I was the one trying to convince you to hold on to your hope. That was before there were people in my life that I could call fit. Matthew started, trailing off before his sentimentality got the better of his Scottish sturdiness. I'm thinking about what comes after you, Peter. I don't think you've accepted that you won't be here forever. I looked out of the horizontal glass pane between Matthew's room and the waiting area. I could see Maria and Henry talking enigmatically. My son was somehow 12 years old. Time had flitted by at a cruel rate. In my eyes, I was still that 22-year-old boy who moved to the village with dreams of a quiet country life. Keep searching for the answer, Peter. Remember what you're protecting. But in the event that you should fail, you need to make sure that somebody takes the reins. No, I said firmly. I'll be the last park ranger, or at least the last one who does anything other than spotting forest fires and helping hikers. There we go, Matthew whispered, smiling. I was worried you had lost that youthful spark for a moment. I don't want you to end up like me, son. I smiled, patting the man's shoulder again before standing up and heading towards the door. Before you go, he suddenly said, we're trapped in this village, but help can still come to us. And that was the last thing that he ever said to me. After mulling over Matthew's parting words, I made an arrangement with Mayor Balfour. She, like many others in the village, was aware of what lay in the Highlands. Not all who visit the village become tied to this place. Tourists come and go from time to time, and there are even villagers who have left without resistance. But it is impossible to say who the Highlands will or will not spare. We don't take any risks. We, or those of us who keep this secret, keep our loved ones here. I have spent 20 years convincing Maria to never leave this place. I'm not a good speaker, I said, laughing into the microphone. But Eileen insisted that I speak to you about a guest. Before I could continue, a chair abruptly squeaked against the floorboards. Heads turned to face a mysterious outsider who strolled down the main aisle. Hello, the man bellowed, chuckling heartily. I'll take over, lad. I can see that you don't want to be standing up there. An Englishman in a room full of Scotsmen. Never ends well now, does it? The room erupted into a chorus of laughter and I awkwardly shuffled away from the microphone, content to be standing silently alongside Eileen. When the man arrived on the stage, he hopped up with ease. "Good evening, my fellow Highlanders," he roared. "My name is Kieran Green. I come from that little hamlet just over the hills. You might know the one, or maybe you don't because, well, you don't really leave this place, do ya?" I anxiously eyed Eileen and she nodded her head. We had not come to the decision easily, but it was time to do things differently from those who had come before us. I just dreaded how my wife and son would react to Kieran's announcement. The man sighed, planting his hands on the podium before him. "You see, there's something that many of you know, something that you've not wanted to tell your loved ones, a secret of the land passed from generation to generation, and I know all about that. These highlands have been host to many a sorry sight. See, our hamlet used to be much bigger, but then they came, dark things in the night. They killed our family and friends and we swore that it would never happen again. We realized that secrets would kill us all." A hushed wave of whispers spread through the hallway and I locked eyes with Maria. "What's happening?" she mouthed at me. I had no response. "There's a special duty performed by the park rangers of this village. Well, the sole remaining ranger, and it doesn't involve spotting fires or herding sheep. It's... some things are better left unsaid." Tommy suddenly shouted, rising to his feet. "Stop making a scene, Tommy," Maggie begged. "I'm protecting you, dear," he said before looking at the crowd. "Yes, there are things that happen in those woods, but the people of this village don't need to know about them." "Wrong," Kieran shouted, silencing my neighbor. "Some of you may have seen things that you couldn't explain. Perhaps you have dismissed those things, but judging by the look on your faces, I would say not. You are not safe, and I ask again, how many of you have left this place?" The room fell silent. "Aye," Kieran nodded. "And how many of you stay because at some point in your youth, somebody warned you not to leave?" I saw faces twist and turn, families eyed one another suspiciously. Eileen's husband cast a disparaging glare in her direction. Maria surveyed me with teary eyes. "I do not blame your village for spending a century concealing this treacherous truth," he said. "But we have watched tragedy after tragedy befall our land, have we not? And with each fresh horror, the darkness grows." "Why now?" a woman cried from the crowd. "Why tell us after all these years?" Kieran turned to face me. "Ask the park ranger." I eyed the vicious mob sitting in the hall. Maria couldn't even look at me. Henry maintained his composure, but the color had drained from the little boy's face. "I made a decision," I said. "A decision backed by Matthew Wright himself." "Don't bring his name into this," a man snarled. "You're not one of us." "Yes, we are," Henry screamed, attempting to stand. Maria held him down. "Matthew and I have seen things that most of you would never understand," I continued, striving to hide my unsteady disposition. "And we've decided to break the cycle." "Please, Mark," Tommy said with tearful eyes. "Enough, you've said your piece, it's done now." I shook my head. "It isn't done, and it'll never be done. Do you want to know what lies in that forest? The dead are dead, and we will continue to feed these highlands for as long as we do nothing. Look at our children, do they deserve this?" "There's nothing that can be done," an old woman called. "All who tried have died." "Not true," Kieran interrupted, pushing me aside and leaning towards the microphone. "I have tried, Peter has tried, and we're still here. We know about the woods, the highlands of the dead, but we keep to ourselves and nothing bad happens," a man shouted. "Oh, sir, bad things happen all the time," Kieran said coldly. "Peter Tully has been giving his soul to the woods for 14 years. He's a shell of a man, look at him, and he does it for you. and if he were to stop, well, the forest would have to look elsewhere to feast on souls. Something has cursed this land, I interjected. We don't know what lies at the heart of the Highlands. It wears many faces and takes many forms. All we know is that it never stops, Kieran finished. Mark, I understand that you want to protect us, Tommy said, but my mother told me things that, look, it's just we can't fight it. Natural or unnatural, the might of the Highlands will always best us. I'm not going to let this place take my boy, I whispered, eyeing Henry. Maria lifted her eyes to meet mine. They were brimming with tears, but she met my gaze, and that was something. Kieran patted my back and took over. I visited one of the lake towns recently, saw an old friend of my grandfather. He told me a story about a witch. Oh, come on, a man sighed. Listen, boy, Kieran spat. You don't want to test me. I'll drag you down to the forest myself and show you the... Kieran Green paused, collecting himself. All that matters is there might be a way to lift this curse, to free you from the death hanging over this place. Peter Tully and I will go to the woods tonight and we will end this. But if we don't, well, at least you will know the truth, and somebody brave can take up the mantle. It never should have been Peter's cross to carry. Matthew Wright forced him here, and... Let's not speak ill of the dead, I said, sensing the hollow atmosphere in the hall. Before I go... Where are you going? Maria cried in a flood of tears. We'll talk later, I said. Look after Henry. All will be well, Kieran promised, ushering me towards him. We will gather here in the morning. The crowd talked restlessly and Eileen rushed to the microphone as Kieran and I slipped out of a back door. I saw Henry standing and watching me with a lost expression. That went about as well as expected. Kieran sat unlocking his vehicle. I sighed, climbing into the passenger seat. Just go. As we tore off the tarmac, a few villagers poured out of the front doors and watched us drive away. They were never going to accept it. They've always known deep down, but they didn't want to know. Would you have done what I did? I asked. I already have, the man sighed. I had a smaller crowd to appease, mind. Well, they deserved to know a long time ago, I said. Well, ignorance is bliss, Kieran replied. But we don't have that luxury in the Highlands. I learned that the hard way. He took a dirt road into the thick of the woods. I frowned. I usually turn a little farther up the main. We all learn hard lessons, Kieran said, interrupting me. My hamlet used to be a village roughly the size of yours, but that all changed when the creatures came. Matthew told you all about it, didn't he? Yeah, the incident at the factory, I said, frowning. But this road is the... And it wouldn't have happened if everybody had known. Kieran interrupted a second time. Since then, every time the creatures come, and they always come, my neighbors know what to do. Of course, they don't know what I do to keep them safe. There are still some secrets that we must carry to the grave. Isn't that right, Park Ranger? He slowed to a stop and secured the handbrake. We were sitting in the middle of the forest. What are you trying to say, Kieran? I asked, unsettled by his shifting demeanor. The man sighed. I wasn't going to come here without a plan, Park Ranger. And do you know what I found when I did a little background research on you? Terrible story from London. A newspaper article about a police officer who fumbled negotiations with a robber. Do you ever dream of that little girl, Peter? The one who died as a result of your miscalculation. I clenched my fists. It wasn't like that. I didn't know that he would shoot. But it's no secret, the whole city knew. That's why we moved to a place in which nobody knew your name, Kieran asked. Why are you doing this? Do you not trust me? Is that the problem? I want the same thing that you want. Oh, I know you do, Peter. And aren't the Highlands lucky to have such a brave Englishman on their side? He's come to save the day. We Scottish peasants would be lost without you. I don't really care about your ancient prejudice. Let's just finish this and... The sudden blow to my temple sent a ripple of pain through my body. Acting on impulse rather than any conscious form of thought, I scrambled for the car door's handle and fell onto the forest floor. Prejudice, it's not as personal as that, Kieran said, stepping out of the driver's side. I mean, I hate the English, don't get me wrong, but this isn't some meaningless act. No, this is about the survival of my people. I groaned, clutching the side of my head and stumbling shakily to my feet. The vision in my right eye was uneven and blurry. My left eye was just as useless as ever, but I could vaguely distinguish Kieran approaching with a torch in his hand, the blunt instrument that he had used to attack me. I don't know how to stop any of this, Kieran admitted, but I do know how to give the woods what it wants, and it's been craving you for a long time. I think it might finally spare my hamlet. All I have to do is give you to it. So I didn't lie, Peter, not really. This is for the greater good. I stumbled to the side, supporting my weight in the car. What about this village? There are people of the Highlands too. Kieran shrugged, striding towards me. Not my people. Concussed and nearly blind, I raised an arm to defend myself, but Kieran swiftly bludgeoned my face a second time, and I fell to the ground in agony. Spitting teeth and blood into the dirt, I tried to crawl away. Family, Peter, he said. You understand, don't you? That's what it's all about. I told you I don't care about Scotland or England. I just care about my own flesh and blood. I've got 2 boys at home, so try to understand that. I rolled onto my back, propping my body against a nearby tree. The wind picked up and I heard strange guttural noises from the earth below us. It's almost time, Kieran said, raising his torch one last time. The forest will be so thankful that I brought you. You have saved people, Peter, just not your people. Barely clinging to consciousness, I spat blood at his feet and the man laughed. Aye, I'll give you that one, Englishman, he said, patting the red specks on his trouser legs. And don't worry, I'll make this quick, I promise. I'm a man of my word. I croakily laughed. You're no man. Kieran scowled, raising his torch to finish the job. I closed my eyes and awaited the embrace of darkness. I could only see Maria and Henry. I prayed that they would find a way to free themselves of the Highlands. I didn't want their forgiveness, just their safety. A thud sounded, but I didn't feel a thing. And when I opened my eyes, I found myself facing an unlikely sight. Tommy Buchanan. He was towering over Kieran's crumpled body, and there was a shovel in his hands, a shovel which he promptly dropped to the ground before rushing over to me. He's no man, and he's certainly no Scotsman. Come on, Peter, I parked a dozen yards down the dirt track, he said, panting as he reached down and hoisted me to my feet. Let's get you to the hospital. I hobbled to the car, supporting my weakening body on Tommy's shoulders. Adrenaline kept me awake, but that was a good thing. I didn't want to pass out with a head injury. I closed the door and Tommy rushed to the driver's side. As his body flitted past the windscreen, I squinted, desperately trying to discern a moving shape at the edge of the tree line. Kieran. Drive, I cried as Tommy clambered into the car. Kieran threw his body onto the bonnet. His bloody, bruised face matched my own. Watch out, I cried as Tommy rapidly reversed the car. The rear bumper collided with a sturdy tree trunk, and Kieran crumpled into the windscreen. I'll kill you both, he said in a half-conscious grumble while weakly pounding the glass. As Tommy reached for the door handle, the wind began to wail shrilly, and then, in a flash of movement, Kieran's body was torn from the front of the car. Tommy and I watched in confusion as a shape rose from the dirt, a horrifyingly tall specter with the faint shape of a woman. But it was not human. I had seen horrors like it before. The undead entity meshed seamlessly with the forest ground, and its branch-like arms seized Kieran by the throat. Something about her was different from the other creatures that I had seen in the Highlands. The tattered clothes, they were so familiar. Mercy, Tommy whispered. It can't be. What? I asked, head falling apart at the seams. Shirley Pond, he said. I recognized that name. I hadn't heard it since the day that I had moved to the village. 14 years earlier, Matthew had told me about a park ranger who had disappeared in the woods, the one who came before me. My friend furiously revved the engine and beelined for the main road. We left Kieran and the undead spirit of Shirley Pond behind. Since that first night in the forest, I've always suspected that it might have been her whose gnarled, rotting hand saved me from the schoolteacher, but I do not know for certain. But I know that she saved Tommy and me. Today the village faced its demons. 5 years had passed since Kieran Green took me to the forest. A lifetime in so many ways. The world has endured wars and a pandemic, but that reality seems so distant and detached from our village's bubble. Since that momentous winter gathering, the villagers have reconciled with one another. Maria and I work together now. I have promised to be a better partner. An arduous road led to that juncture. You see, it was never a question of whether I had told the truth in that town meeting. Nobody doubted the insidious nature of the Highlands. Even those who had never ever walked the woods. We had all seen things. We had all felt things. No, this was about forgiving deceit, more than overcoming disbelief. Following my brush with death, Tommy accompanied me on my shifts, though Maggie didn't like him doing so. I wasn't keen on the old man doing it either. His arthritis was worsening, but he insisted that somebody needed to look after me. He still views me as the boy that he met 20 years ago. Speaking of which, Henry is 16 now, an adult apparently. Then again, I shouldn't tease him. Maria and I were only 6 years older than him when we moved to this place. A horrifying thought. This morning, as I sat in my watchtower and basked in the warm glow of the sunrise, a sudden knock jolted me from my chair. I spilled my cup of tea and I sighed heavily, before swiveling around to face the door. Outside the window there stood a man that I didn't recognize. "May I enter?" he called. The man spoke with an English accent which left me leery. "Not until I know your name and why you're here," I said, reaching for Matthew's old revolver beneath my desk. Not a legal firearm, of course, but my duties aren't exactly the same as those of normal rangers. "You don't know me, but my name's Darren Grayson and I came across your story. I can help." I had heard that before. "May I enter?" he asked again. "Yes," I said, warily sliding the gun under my jacket. Darren opened the door and shuffled inside. He was around my age and he bore a similar tired and disheveled look, scruffy facial hair crooked at crow's feet. The man sat on the edge of my desk a few feet from me, and I surveyed him curiously. "What are you doing here, Darren Grayson?" I asked. "I come from a hamlet over the ridge," he replied, pointing out of the watchtower window. "And it—" "Get out," I coldly interrupted, sliding the weapon from my coat. Darren's eyes widened and he quickly slid off the desk. "Come to avenge Kieran, is that it?" I asked, narrowing my eyes and raising the revolver. "Kieran?" Darren asked. "How do you know that name?" "Your friend came here 5 years ago," I muttered. "He had promised to save my village too." Darren raised his hands. "Listen, I don't know what happened, but Kieran was a very dangerous man." "Please leave," I said. "When you shared your story with the world, it found its way to me," Darren continued. "I'm not going to tell you again," I hissed. "He's dead, Peter," Darren said. "Kieran's dead." "I know," I replied. "Shirley Pond killed him." "What?" Darren asked. "No, he died a year ago. He tried to sacrifice me to the forest folk, but they claimed him." "He made it back to the hamlet," I replied, eyes wide. "Yes, why does it matter? He's dead. I saw it happen," Darren replied. "Well, that's what I thought too," I said. Darren paused for a moment. I have good reason to believe that this time he died for good. That's why I'm here, Peter. The forest folk have perished. The old factory workers? I asked. Darren nodded. It happened in early spring. I sounded the alarm when they had emerged from the forest, but they collapsed in the snow. One by one, we watched their bodies for days, waiting for signs of movement. They slowly started to rot, and then, with unnatural haste, the forest reclaimed them. It was like nothing that I had ever seen. What does this have to do with Kieran's death? I asked. Something came from the forest, Peter. A skeletal thing, Darren said. The woman, I whispered, shaking. Woman? He asked. No, it wasn't anything remotely resembling a man or a woman. It was a body constructed of entwined branches. It whispered to me, the rotten seed has been purged from this land. I paused. Kieran? Kieran, Darren agreed. No single thing poisoned our land. This infection has festered for a century or more, worsened by tragedy after tragedy. Perhaps since people first had settled in the Highlands. Perhaps it infects all places to some degree, and it spreads by people, I finished. Darren nodded. People. Perhaps in our two hometowns we have been misfortunate enough to experience one too many tragedies. The Greens had a long history of causing pain and suffering. It began long before Kieran. It was his great-grandfather who ran the factory, Lachlan Green, a tyrant who employed young boys and girls for a pittance. He forced them to work in terrible conditions, no sunlight, little food. Many of the children developed rickets, and when they died a young unnatural death, the forest claimed them. They joined the legions of undead and they were sentenced to an afterlife in the Highlands. Most likely they came to our hamlet seeking revenge for Lachlan Green's injustice. They only ever wanted his great-grandson, I said. Darren nodded. Yes, and after they were finally laid to rest, I could have left the Highlands with my family. But our hamlet has become a quiet, beautiful place. It was only when you shared your tale of horror that I realized this disease spreads beyond the ridge. So you think something rotten lives in this village? I asked. The man nodded. There was the school teacher who killed those children, I started. Arnold Haversham, Darren asked. Well, he's dead. He died nearly 30 years ago. I stalled, rubbing my chin thoughtfully. Like you said, it's never one thing that poisons a land. It's generational trauma. Darren nodded. Arnold mustn't have been the only evil at work. But I know these people, they're neighbors and friends. I don't want to imagine a wolf living among us, I said. While Kieran was a beloved leader, Darren explained, dark things always hide in plain sight. The things I see in these woods are so often tied to that school, I said. Nearly every night I see that building amidst the trees. Somebody in this town knows something, Darren said. I recalled a detail that had played on my mind for years. A joke that Tommy had made during that meeting in 2018, before Maggie had interrupted him. He was on the verge of calling the mayor Mrs. Aversham. I was certain of it. Come on, I said. We're going to see a friend. Oh, Darren replied, climbing to his feet. I think he might know something about the people that Arnold left behind, I explained. We drove back to the village and I anxiously twiddled my thumbs as we pulled onto Tommy's driveway. I didn't want to apprehend the man, but time was slipping through our fingers. Too many decades had been spent under the gnarled, decaying thumbnail of whatever lived beneath the Highlands. I don't know why I said that about Eileen. Tommy nervously stuttered. It was a dumb joke to make. What was the joke? I asked. The man sighed exasperatedly. Who's your friend? Darren Grayson, my companion replied, outstretching his hand. Oh great, Tommy laughed. It's a bloomin' invasion of English folk. Tommy, tell me what you know, I said. Nothing, Peter, it was a joke, he insisted. Mrs. Aversham, was she married to Arnold Aversham? I asked. Tommy laughed and then he immediately stopped himself upon seeing my face. Why's that so funny? I asked. The man paused for a second before sighing. It took me back to my days on the force, investigating crimes. Tommy was a lovely man, but he didn't perform well under pressure. My persistence finally wore him down. I've still got it, I thought to myself. Eileen was Arnold's sister, he muttered. She changed her name after, well, everything. We all loved her so, we never blamed her for it. We made her the mayor for crying out loud. Is she his only surviving family? I inquired. What's the use in dredging up the past, Peter? Tommy asked. Well, there might be a way to end all of this, I said. The man eyed me uncertainly. I sighed. 30 years had passed since Arnold Aversham took those lives, but the evil in the forest lingers, and it won't extinguish until we stamp out every last weed. Weed? Tommy asked. What are you saying? He's saying that evil lives here, Darren said, right in the heart of your village. Tommy scoffed. You believe this, do you, Peter? One of our friends, perhaps somebody in one of our families. That school has haunted the forest for decades, I said. It calls to me there has to be a reason for that. There has to be something that we missed. Arnold Aversham is dead, Tommy said. What more is there to say? A terrible thing happened and the forest hasn't forgotten that. Trauma stains the Highlands of the dead. That's how you've always explained it, Peter. Well, what do I know? What do any of us know? I replied. But if Darren's story about lifting the curse happens to be true, it is true, Darren promised. Well, I said, I think we should go and talk to the mayor. Tommy sighed. It's not Eileen who can help you. Well, then who can help us? I asked. The man cleared his throat. Her mother, Geraldine Aversham. She's still alive? I asked incredulously. He nodded. Aye, she keeps to herself. Old Victorian built by the lake at the forest edge. You know the one. That rundown shack off the A road, I said. It always looked abandoned to me. Haunted. Might as well be. Nobody but Eileen has seen Geraldine since Arnold did those terrible things. She doesn't speak. Doesn't even eat without assistance. There's nothing but a ghost in her place, Tommy said. It's a sad thing. She was the heart and soul of the village for many years. We all miss her too. But Eileen says her mother just won't face the world. So she probably wouldn't talk to us, Darren asked. Tommy shook his head. We have to try, I said. With Tommy anxiously watching from the driveway, Darren and I hopped into the car, and we drove to the lake. Before today, I hardly had noticed the Victorian heritage of the ramshackle abode. There was nothing grand or glamorous about the neglected home. It was little more than a forgotten farmhouse, an eyesore that I had never inspected during my 20 years in the Highlands. A feeble structure held together by flimsy foundations, much like everything and everyone in the village. That's Eileen's car, I said as Darren parked alongside a gray Range Rover. It might be for the best that she's here, Darren said, removing the key from the ignition. You know Eileen, she might be able to get Geraldine to talk. Yeah, I said. As we exited the vehicle, nerves constricted my gut. I eyed the ancient house with mistrust, gingerly treading on cracked and grass-ridden stonework. We stepped onto the wooden porch before Geraldine's door, and it was not just the rickety, unreliable floorboards that filled me with unease. It was the atmosphere of our mid-afternoon house call. The lake was unnervingly still, but the woods swayed unstably, beckoning us to enter. I couldn't imagine living at the foot of the frightful forest by choice. Darren knocked on Geraldine's door and we waited for several minutes. Maybe we should. When Eileen answered, she was flustered and horrified to see us. Peter, who is this? She asked. Darren Grayson, he comes from the hamlet beyond the ridge and tease. You got a lot of nerve, Eileen interjected, eyeing Darren coldly. Kieran Green tried to condemn the people of this village too. I know, Darren said. I know that, Mayor Balfour. But he's gone now and we can fix everything. Our hamlet is free of the dead. My phone buzzed and I pulled it out of my pocket while the pair continued talking. It was Maria. I thought. I forgot to take Henry to school. I hurriedly texted my wife to apologize and I explained that I was at Geraldine Aversham's house. She replied to say that Henry was already having a bad day. He was worried about the future, university, something that he would never get to experience if he was truly trapped in the village forever. Everything okay, Peter? Darren asked. Yeah, it can wait, I said, putting my phone back in my pocket. Did you explain everything? It's not happening, Peter. Eileen insisted. My mother won't talk to you. She doesn't talk to anyone. If we could just see her, I started. I said no, Eileen shouted, slamming the door in our faces. Well, that was odd, Darren said, sighing. Another dead end. I didn't spend many years as a police officer before moving to the Highlands. I would hardly call myself a world-renowned detective, and yet it was undeniable. Eileen is hiding something, I said. Darren frowned. Is she not just being protective? Her family has gone through a lot. No, I replied, shaking my head. Her demeanor was off, and I'm thinking about what Tommy said. Geraldine was a beloved member of the community, and she's lived as a social recluse for nearly 30 years. No friends or family to visit her. Grief is a wretched thing, Darren said, sighing. I don't deny that, but I think Tommy and the other villagers buy that tale, but... You don't trust Eileen, Darren said. No, I replied. And the more that I thought about it, the more I realized that I had never really trusted her. There had always been something evasive about the woman. She was a person of few words, a select few words. As Darren and I stood on the porch, contemplating our next move, a creak sounded from the rear of the house, the sound of a door opening. Reckon that's her, Darren asked. Only one way to know for sure, I said, motioning for the neighborhood watchman to follow me. As we crept around the side of the derelict house, I noticed a large window coated in assorted forms of overgrowth. I'm not sure what possessed me, but it was more than piqued curiosity. I found myself tearing the vines in the shrubbery away, and then I began to scrub the window's filth with the sleeve of my jacket. Darren, I whispered, you might want to see this. Through a cleaned loophole I had formed in the center of the glass pane, we could see Geraldine's living room. It was illuminated by the midday sunlight, and on a dusty, neglected armchair, there sat a pile of ashy clothes with the vague posture of a sitting person. Is that? Darren started quivering. Geraldine Aversham, I said. Darren and I did not say any more than that. We raced into the forest, keenly pursuing Eileen. She fled at a quickened pace, but her footsteps betrayed her. And when we had reached a sprawling clearing in the woods, I knew that we had found her secret. What is that? Darren asked breathlessly. The entrance to Hades, I said. The ground had parted to reveal horrors in the hollow beneath, just as it did 20 years ago. And buried amongst mounds of soil and rocks, the twisted version of the village school stared back at us. It did not rise proudly above the tree line as it once had. It was a sunken wreckage hiding in an inexplicable chasm. The building lay on its back with its front doors facing the sky. "Wait," Darren said as I jumped into the ditch. "What are you doing?" I carefully tiptoed across the building, gulping as the brickwork groaned beneath my feet. "She's in here," I said, pointing at muddy footprints across the wooden doors. "I know, but don't open those doors, are you crazy?" he asked. "Nothing is ever as it seems in this forest," I said, smiling and stamping. The doors swung open and I fell forwards, but I did not endlessly plummet through a downwards facing corridor. Gravity shifted and I tumbled to the tiled floor of the haunted and lightless school. When I turned to look at the doors behind me, motion sickness seized my body. There was something truly ghastly about seeing the trees and the sky at a right angle. It was made all the worse by Darren's sideways body sliding into view. The man sighed and climbed down the hole. He tumbled through the doorway and fell onto his face. "I feel a little sick," Darren muttered as we both stumbled to our feet. "Then don't look behind you," I said, nodding my head at the doors. As I started to walk down the corridor, I heard the man pivot to see what I meant, and he swiftly retched on the floor. Consumed by the building's darkness, I fumbled in my coat pocket to find my torch, and when I lit up the hallway, I was 20 years younger. My mind returned to that very first night in the Highlands, nothing more than a frightened boy in a haunted house. After so many years, the terror had still not abated. Some horrors lie beyond what our primal brains can conceive. We strode cautiously through the school, following the trail of mud down a weaving maze of hallways. And then we came to that door, that horrible door. Classroom 11A. There was movement inside. I turned off the flashlight and I motioned for Darren to crouch down. "They want to ruin everything, my darling," a voice sobbed from inside the room. Darren and I peeked over the bottom of the classroom window. Eileen was inside, but that wasn't what terrified us. She was talking to a looming ghoul, a corpse that I recognized. Arnold Aversham. The malformed monstrosity that had caused so much death and suffering. And as it leaned towards Eileen, its voice carried in an inaudible, unearthly tone. "I know, my love, I'll bring you more little ones, I promise," she cooed, stroking her undead brother's cheek. "But things have been difficult." That same icy, inhuman whisper sounded. "Yes, Arnold, the ranger. He's brought someone to the village and..." Another whisper sharply sliced into her sentence. "Oh," Eileen said. "I see." And then her eyes shot to the window. She and her haunted sibling looked at Darren and me with equally black and lifeless eyes. Before we could rise to our feet, Arnold's arms had elongated. The door was wrenched from its hinges and our bodies were dragged into the classroom by the murderous school teacher's undead fingers. He held us down as the mare walked over to our writhing bodies. The withered, gray-haired woman sighed before squatting to my eye level. "Do you love your family, Peter?" she asked. "Would you do anything for them?" "I have always loved my brother. Nobody else did. Not the father who left us. Not our insufferable goody-two-shoes mother. Even when Arnold became a school teacher, following in her footsteps, he still wasn't good enough. But we had silenced her ceaseless chattering and nagging, now didn't we, Arnold?" "You're unwell, Eileen," I croaked, as Arnold's terrifying figures constricted my breath. "That's what they all said to my sweet brother," she moaned, clenching her fists. "I mean, yes, he struggled to socialize. He didn't want to wear the mask that was thrust upon him, but he was different and he was pure. And those children..." Ghostly muffled wails sounded beyond the walls. "They were spoiled brats," Eileen snarled. "They should have been honored that Arnold chose them. They were the purest of the bunch, and he wanted to be with them forever. What purer love can there be? As for you..." The woman walked over to Darren Grayson. "The cleanser of the Highlands. Death follows in your wake now, doesn't it, Mr. Grayson? But your story ends here. This is our land, she shrieked, clasping her hands around Darren's throat. And when I'm done with the two of you, I'll pay a visit to your little hamlet, Mr. Grayson. Perhaps you have some pretty young playthings for my beautiful brother. In a sudden blur of motion, Darren plunged a knife into Eileen's abdomen. I hadn't seen his arm wriggle free of its restraints. The deranged woman howled in excruciating pain, clutching her wounded torso and stumbling backwards. Her inhuman brother released us and he rushed to his sister's aid, cradling her in his rotting arms. Darren and I quickly scrambled to our feet. Is it over? I asked, backing towards the door. If she dies, Darren replied, joining me. The forest needs to be freed from. The forest? Eileen spluttered, laughing. I've never understood this fascination with trees and earth. I am the Highlands. Before we could respond, a sinister spectacle unfolded. Arnold Aversham's deformed body enveloped Eileen. His rotten flesh merged with hers and the pair formed a singular abomination of decay and evil. I recognized the outline of the monstrosity before me. The horror that had dropped my baby from the watchtower. Had my boy been intended as a prize for her brother? The 10-foot-tall entity lumbered towards us on twitching, near-fleshless legs. Its giant form was bent sideways as it could scarcely fit in the room, and it only kept growing. Darren and I ran. I'm out of ideas, Peter, the man cried as we sprinted down the corridor. Yep, I shouted in response. The creature was pursuing without pause for breath, and its nearing growls made it quite apparent that we were not going to escape. It was too fast, but as we neared the school's entryway, I became aware of the floor's dampness. Peter, Darren started. I know, I replied. It smells like petrol. And as we turned onto the final stretch of the corridor facing the outer world, I saw something entirely unexpected. In the entrance of the school, silhouetted by the day's dying light, a man and a woman stood anxiously. I could only distinguish their outlines, but I knew who they were. Is that Tommy? And Maria, I said. Hurry, Tommy yelled. Before I could respond, I was swept from my feet. My body somersaulted into the school lockers like a limp ragdoll, and my revolver clattered to the floor. I looked up at the enormous annihilator, the monster that had tormented our village for 30 years. A monster, it seemed, of two halves. Two monstrous siblings. It had to die. And as I lay in a thick trail of petrol, I started to piece together the plan that Tommy and Maria had made. When we were clear of the school, they planned to set the building ablaze. However, Darren didn't run towards the exit. He beelined for the revolver. Get out of here, I cried. The Aversham abomination clutched Darren by the neck and hoisted him into the air. I saw the fear in the man's eyes as the unholy monster began howling in his face. Not wasting a moment, I stumbled to my feet and scooped up the firearm, before aiming at the creature's arm. I prayed that I wouldn't miss. I prayed that I wouldn't hit Darren by mistake. After removing the safety, I fired. The Aversham creature screeched in agony and its fingers reflexively released Darren's neck. Come on, I shouted, pulling the man to his feet. We scurried towards the exit and I could see Maria fiddling with something. Our trusty lighter from back home. Not so trusty these days, I remembered. I had watched both Tommy and my wife fiddle with the device, while sweat dripped down their faces. When Darren and I reached the entrance and we turned to face the Avershams, the seemingly unwounded monster hurtled towards us. Peter, Tommy cried. The darkened, unnaturally long limb had silently spiraled around the corridor, merging with the forest's overgrowth. I hadn't seen it slither towards me, but I felt it yank my body to the ground. My revolver flew from my hand and the beast began to pull me into its domain. Peter, Maria screamed, bending to pick up my dropped weapon. Let him go. A gunshot rang out, tearing into the creature's deteriorating flesh. I used the split-second distraction to stamp on the monster's arm, and it loosened its undead fingers, freeing me from its grip. I shuffled backwards, joining the others at the entrance. Maria fired again. The second bullet didn't connect with the monster, but she wasn't aiming for it. The petrol trail burst into flames, and the fire spread at such speed that the Avershams were already engulfed before they could screech in terror. We carefully backed out of the school, tumbling to the safety blanket of the forest floor, and I breathed a sigh of relief to find myself facing the right way up. Gravity had been restored. The four of us watched the inferno consume the school. Wallpaper withered, ceilings collapsed, and the shrieking abomination fell to its knees. A raging fire burnt that unhallowed place to charred ruins. We waited. None of us believed it would be over until the monstrosity had been turned to ash. And then, when nothing of the Aversham abomination remained, the ground began to quake. The four of us stepped back, allowing the forest to reseal above the spectral school. Dirt piled into the cavity, grass rebuilt itself, and the air warmed. The Highlands felt quiet, as if nothing had ever happened. "Look," Darren whispered, pointing at movement in the trees. A branch-like entity had emerged, and it was followed by a blinding ray of sunlight like a heavenly being. The phantom had matched the description of the phenomena that Darren had described, the being that came after the cleansing of his hamlet. With trepidation, we watched the woodland creature slink into the empty clearing. It eyed us with what I presumed to be its face, and then it ceremoniously planted its roots into the soil. Slowly but surely, the creature transformed into a large pine tree. It sprouted luscious green leaves and bloomed vibrantly. The proud pine rose a foot taller than the surrounding trees, and its colorful leaves distinguished it from the rest of the barren and wintry forest. The freshly grown tree lightened the air, a hard thing to explain, but it did just that. The weightiness of the forest had lifted. "I feel freer," Tommy said. "Thank you," I whispered to my wife, embracing her. "It's over, we can live again," she tearfully said. I prayed that this marks a new chapter for our village. These will always be the Highlands of the dead, but the dead can finally rest.